Tonight, we open a door into one of the most guarded mysteries of history, a connection stretching from the ruins of Jerusalem to the heart of Rome. Two temples, separated by centuries, yet bound by secrets carved into stone and sealed in silence. The Temple of Solomon was said to house the Ark of the Covenant, the dwelling place of God himself. Destroyed and lost to time, its memory should have faded. But what if it never truly disappeared? What if its blueprint, its rituals, its very soul were carried westward and reborn inside the Vatican? St. Peter's Basilica towers as the symbol of Catholic faith, yet its pillars, its dome, its very foundations echo the temple that once stood in Jerusalem. From ancient rites preserved in mass to hidden archives that may still guard fragments of the original design, the Vatican appears less like a church built from scratch and more like a temple reborn in disguise. So before you dismiss this as coincidence, ask yourself, why does Rome mirror Jerusalem? Why does the Vatican guard symbols that trace back to Solomon's sanctuary? And if the temple was never truly lost, what does that mean for prophecy, for faith, and for the future of the world? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step into the Vatican and some secrets were never meant to be revealed. Two temples, two worlds, one mystery. Imagine the Temple of Solomon rising in ancient Jerusalem, a sacred fortress of stone and gold, said to house the very presence of God. Now picture St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, its towering dome casting a shadow across the Vatican, a place billions of people see as the center of faith. Separated by thousands of years, separated by two great civilizations, yet somehow, when you look close enough, they seem to mirror each other, as if bound by an invisible thread across time. Why would two sacred sites built so far apart echo one another in design, in power, and in purpose? And who made sure that connection would never be forgotten? The Temple of Solomon was more than just a building. It was built as the dwelling place of the divine, a house said to contain the Ark of the Covenant itself. Ancient writers described it with perfect dimensions, pillars of bronze, altars of gold, chambers aligned to the heavens. It was not simply architecture, it was a cosmic key tying earth to heaven. Yet it was destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again. Over centuries, it became more myth than memory. But myths do not vanish, they echo. In Rome, centuries later, another structure began to rise, one that would come to symbolize ultimate spiritual power in the Western world. St. Peter's Basilica, crowned by Michelangelo's dome, designed to dominate the skyline, became more than a church. It became a throne for divine authority. Its foundation, according to tradition, was laid upon the bones of the Apostle Peter, the rock upon which Christ's church would be built. But when you step back and see its proportions, when you look at the symbolism carved into its heart, something ancient stirs. Why does the Vatican guard a design that recalls the mysteries of Solomon's temple? Why do its rituals mirror those performed by ancient priests? Why does its very city layout echo the geometry once described in sacred texts thousands of years before? These are not accidents, they are signals. From the start, the Church claimed to be the New Jerusalem, a spiritual continuation of the Old Covenant. But claiming that title was not enough. It had to embody it, in stone, in ritual, in hidden meaning. When the dome rises above Rome, it stands where the Holy of Holies once stood in Jerusalem. When the priests process through their rituals, the incense, the chants, the vestments, they trace steps once taken by Levites in the Temple of Solomon. What if the Vatican was not just inspired by Solomon's temple, but saw itself as its rebirth? What if, behind the golden altars and marble columns, lies a deliberate attempt to carry forward the very power once held in Jerusalem? If so, the question is not whether Rome became the New Jerusalem. The question is why it needed to. Two temples, one in ruin, remembered only in fragments, one still alive, commanding billions. Yet beneath the centuries and the distance, their reflections matched too perfectly to ignore. The Temple of Solomon may have been destroyed, but perhaps it was never lost. Perhaps it lives on, reborn in the heart of the Vatican, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to see the mirror and ask the forbidden question: why do these two sacred sites mirror each other across time? In the heart of ancient Jerusalem, more than 2,900 years ago, a building rose that would capture the imagination of prophets, kings, and generations yet unborn. This was the Temple of Solomon, spoken of in Scripture as a place not built for men but for the very presence of God. The Bible describes how King Solomon, son of David, gathered the finest craftsmen, the rarest cedar wood from Lebanon, and metals drawn from distant lands to create a house unlike any other. Its blueprints were said to come not from mortal minds, but from a divine command, measurements whispered by God himself. The temple was not just stone and timber, it was a cosmic symbol. Two massive bronze pillars named Boaz and Jachin stood at its entrance, not merely as supports but as guardians of sacred meaning. Their names carried secrets of strength and stability, keys to a higher order of wisdom. Inside, chambers were layered with gold, ceilings carved with cherubim and palm trees, walls shimmering with precious stones. At the very center lay the Holy of Holies, a room so sacred that only the high priest could enter, and even then only once a year. Within it rested the Ark of the Covenant, said to hold the 10 Commandments, the rod of Aaron, and the manna from heaven. Yet, the most mysterious part was its proportions. Scholars and mystics alike have argued that the temple's dimensions mirrored the cosmos, that its layout was a reflection of heavenly order mapped onto the earth. Some believe its design encoded advanced knowledge of astronomy, geometry, even resonance and sound. The temple was a bridge between realms, a structure meant to align man with the divine. But what happened to it? The first temple stood for centuries, a shining beacon at the heart of Jerusalem. Then in the year 586 before Christ, it was destroyed by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar. The ark vanished from history. Some say it was hidden before the invasion, buried beneath the city, or spirited away by priests to lands unknown. Others believe it was taken as spoils of war. Whatever the truth, the blueprint of the temple did not die with its walls. It lingered in memory, in scattered scrolls, in whispered traditions that survived exile and conquest. Later, a second temple was built, and still later, it too would fall to Roman legions in the year 70. Once again, the sacred space was erased from the earth, yet not from the human mind. Its proportions, its symbols, its rituals lived on in coded texts, preserved by scribes, hidden by mystics, and perhaps carried forward into unexpected places. If the Temple of Solomon truly held a divine design, then it was more than a relic of Israelite history. It was a pattern of power, a key to uniting heaven and earth. Such a pattern would be too precious to vanish, and if fragments of that blueprint survived, then the question is not only where they went, but who holds them now. Perhaps in hidden vaults beneath Rome, perhaps in the hands of those who claim spiritual dominion. The lost blueprint of Solomon's temple may not be lost at all. It may be the secret foundation upon which empires have built their thrones. When the early Christians began to build their places of worship, they faced more than just the challenge of survival. They were a small faith rising within the ruins of Rome, a world that had seen temples to Jupiter, to Mars, to Venus, yet nothing that could rival the memory of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Though the temple itself was gone, its echo lived on, and those echoes began to appear quietly in the stones of Christian sanctuaries long before the Renaissance made them grand. Step into some of the oldest churches in Rome, and you notice something strange. Pillars rising in pairs, carved with patterns that seem to mirror descriptions from the Bible. Two at the entrance, recalling Boaz and Jachin, the twin guardians of Solomon's temple. These pillars were not needed for engineering alone. They were symbols, statements that the faith of the new covenant was tied to the wisdom of the old. To the untrained eye, they were simply decoration. To those who understood the story, they were a code. Sacred measurements also made their way into the early basilicas. The length and width of aisles, the number of steps leading to an altar, even the height of the apse, often followed ratios that resembled the proportions of the temple described in the Old Testament. Numbers like 3, 7, and 12 were not chosen at random. They were the same numbers woven into the fabric of Israelite ritual, now preserved in stone under a new faith. It was as if every church was secretly declaring that it was not abandoning the past, but fulfilling it. Sacred geometry found its way into mosaics, floor patterns, and domes, circles within squares, stars with 6 points, designs that hinted at cosmic balance. These shapes had been present in Jewish thought, believed to represent harmony between the earthly and the divine. Early Christians carried them forward, embedding them where few would question their meaning, but where the initiated would recognize the inheritance. The buildings themselves became silent sermons, teaching continuity without words. Why would the first Christian builders copy these motifs? Some argue it was reverence for their spiritual roots. Others believe it was more deliberate, a claim that the church now carried the authority once held in Jerusalem. By evoking the Temple of Solomon, they were not just borrowing style, they were declaring succession. Rome was not merely a city of pagans converted, it was a new holy ground. The most striking part is that this embedding of Solomonic patterns happened long before the architectural explosion of the Renaissance. Long before Michelangelo and Raphael painted Rome with genius, long before Peter's Basilica crowned the skyline, these quiet hints were already there, hidden in columns, in ratios, in the very way churches faced the rising Sunday. It suggests something unsettling. The memory of Solomon's temple was never lost. It was carried like a hidden seed, planted within the early stones of Christianity, waiting to bloom again when the time was right. And if that is true, then every church built in those early centuries was not just a house of worship, but a coded message. A message whispering across time that the legacy of the temple still lived, not in Jerusalem, but in Rome. When the Temple of Solomon fell, and Jerusalem lay in ruins, not everything was lost to fire and conquest. The memory of the sacred place did not vanish with the stones. Jewish priests and scribes carried fragments of that knowledge with them into exile. They preserved the measurements, the rituals, the prayers, sometimes written on scrolls, sometimes locked away in oral tradition passed from father to son. The temple might have been destroyed, but its image lived on in the minds of those who once served within its walls. In Babylon, and later under Persian rule, these exiles began to shape a system of remembrance. They recorded visions of prophets who spoke of the temple. They sketched details of its courts and its inner chambers. They described the role of incense, sacrifices, and chants. Some of this became scripture. Some remained hidden, guarded for fear it would be desecrated. Knowledge that was once public became the guarded property of a select few. The temple became both a ruin and a treasure, existing only in fragments. Centuries later, when Christianity emerged, these fragments found new guardians. The first Christians were Jews who still carried the memory of the temple. Though they now worshipped differently, they could not erase what had shaped their spiritual world. The rhythm of services, the structure of prayers, even the idea of an altar carried echoes of Jerusalem. As the church spread into the Roman world, these traditions were woven into a new fabric, no longer openly tied to Solomon, yet never truly severed from him. Then came the monks. In darkened scriptoria across Europe, bent over parchment by candlelight, they became the silent custodians of forgotten lore. They copied texts that contained veiled descriptions of the temple. They translated works from Hebrew and Greek into Latin. They preserved rituals in coded language, embedding fragments of the old within the new. In doing so, they were not only saving Christian teaching, they were unknowingly, or perhaps deliberately, safeguarding the legacy of Solomon's temple. As the centuries passed, This chain of guardianship narrowed until one institution stood at its centre, the Vatican. Within its stone walls, manuscripts from every corner of the known world gathered. Among them, scholars believe, are texts that hold detailed references to the temple, its hidden chambers, and perhaps even its lost artifacts. The Vatican became the heir of traditions once carried by exiled priests, once whispered by scribes, once preserved by monks. Why would this knowledge matter so much? Because to understand the temple is to understand the blueprint of divine order. To claim that knowledge is to claim a direct link between heaven and earth. And whoever holds it can shape the story of faith for all mankind. The Vatican may not have built the temple, but through centuries of careful preservation, it became its keeper. And if the legacy of Solomon's temple still influences the rituals of today, then perhaps the custodianship never ended. It only changed hands, moving from Jerusalem's priests to Rome's popes, hidden in silence, waiting for someone to piece together the fragments of a forgotten past. When Jerusalem fell and the temple was reduced to memory, the spiritual heart of the ancient world seemed broken. Yet, out of the ashes, a new centre began to rise, not in the east but in the west. Rome, once the empire that had destroyed the Second Temple in the year 70, soon declared itself the chosen city of God. The Vatican, built upon the burial place of the Apostle Peter, became the foundation for a bold claim. Rome was no longer just the capital of an empire, it was the new Jerusalem. This transformation was not sudden. In the early centuries, Christians met in homes, catacombs, and modest churches. But as the faith grew, and emperors like Constantine embraced it, Rome gained the opportunity to craft its spiritual throne. With basilicas rising, relics enshrined, and rituals formalized, the city positioned itself as more than a hub of power. It was the successor of the Holy City. By claiming Peter as its rock, Rome tied its authority directly to Christ. But beneath this surface, the symbolism of Solomon's temple lingered, shaping the identity of the Vatican as more than a church. It was a continuation of something older. Pilgrims were taught that they no longer needed to look to the ruins of Jerusalem. The true holy city had shifted westward. Rome's bishops styled themselves as heirs of both Peter and Solomon, guardians of a spiritual kingdom that could never be destroyed by sword or fire. By the 4th century, the Vatican began to adopt rituals and imagery that echoed the temple. Incense drifting like smoke from ancient altars, sanctuaries divided into holy spaces, vestments embroidered with symbols, all reinforced the message. The covenant had not ended, it had moved. For many, this claim was more than faith. It was a reordering of sacred geography. To visit Rome was to touch holy ground. To kneel before the Pope was to kneel before the living successor of the priesthood that once ruled in Jerusalem. This was not coincidence, it was strategy. By shifting the centre of authority, the Vatican created a new axis of the world. Jerusalem might still hold memory, but Rome held the future. Over time, the city of 7 hills became draped in titles that once belonged to Zion. It was called the Eternal City, the place of divine judgment, the seat of truth. Scriptures that once pointed east were reinterpreted to point west. And as pilgrims crossed continents to reach Rome, the illusion became reality. For them, the Vatican was not just another church, it was the new temple. The power of this claim cannot be overstated. By declaring itself the New Jerusalem, the Vatican inherited a divine legacy and placed itself above kings and empires. It was no longer the Empire of Rome that conquered the world by sword. It was the Church of Rome that conquered by spirit. And if the Temple of Solomon had once been the centre of God's presence, the Vatican now insisted that presence had never left. It had simply moved, carried not by armies, but by faith, into the very heart of Rome. For centuries, the greatest mystery of the ancient world has been the fate of the Ark of the Covenant. This sacred chest, described in the Bible as covered in gold, and guarded by cherubim, was believed to hold the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and the manna from heaven. Within the Temple of Solomon, it rested in the Holy of Holies, the beating heart of the sanctuary, a vessel of divine presence. But when the Babylonians destroyed the temple in the year 586 before Christ, the ark disappeared from the record of history. No conqueror boasted of taking it. No priest wrote of hiding it. It simply vanished. Legends have swirled ever since. Some say it was buried deep beneath the ruins of Jerusalem by priests who foresaw the destruction. Others believe it was taken to Ethiopia, guarded by a hidden order of monks. Still others whisper it was carried to distant lands, its power too great to be left in the open. But there is another possibility, one that ties directly into the rise of the early church. What if relics of the temple, maybe even the ark itself, found their way into the hands of those who built the foundations of Christianity? The early Christians saw themselves as heirs to the covenant, not destroyers of it. They read the same scriptures that spoke of Solomon's temple. They traced their faith back through David, Abraham, and Moses. For them, the ark was not just a relic of the past. It was a sign of God's unbroken promise. Imagine what it would mean if the first generations of church leaders somehow gained access to the ark or fragments of it. The authority of the church would not only rest on teachings and faith, it would be physically anchored to the most sacred object in Jewish history. Hints of this possibility appear in strange ways. The design of early Christian altars often resembles the ark's proportions. The practice of placing relics beneath altars echoes the idea of divine presence resting within a holy vessel. In some traditions, the high altar itself is spoken of as the new ark, containing not stone tablets, but the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. Was this merely symbolism, or was it a quiet continuation of something far more real? As Rome rose to power, rumours grew that treasures from the Jewish temple had been taken by Roman legions after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. Ancient writers describe golden vessels, menorahs, and sacred objects paraded through Rome in triumph. But curiously, the ark is never mentioned. If Rome possessed it, why the silence? Some scholars suggest it was hidden away, preserved not for emperors, but for a new order of priests who would guard it under the banner of Christianity. If the Vatican ever gained the ark or relics from Solomon's temple, it would explain much about its unshakable claim to spiritual authority. The ark symbolized God's direct presence among his people. To hold it would be to hold legitimacy beyond question. Perhaps this is why its fate remains clouded in mystery. To reveal, it would shatter the line between myth and reality. To hide it keeps power firmly in the hands of those who know. The ark may not be gone. It may rest, unseen, beneath the altars of Rome, a secret too powerful to be allowed into the light. When Constantine rose to power in the early 4th century, Rome was a city divided between fading pagan traditions and the growing strength of Christianity. The emperor's dramatic conversion changed history forever. By embracing the cross, he transformed a once persecuted movement into the official faith of the empire. But Constantine did more than legalize Christianity. He built its foundations in stone. The first great churches he commissioned were not just places of worship. They were symbols of divine kingship, carefully crafted to echo the authority once embodied by Solomon's temple. One of his most famous projects was the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, constructed in the year 326. Unlike the humble house churches that came before, this basilica was colossal, filled with columns, courtyards, and shrines. Its scale was not accidental. Constantine wanted to present himself as a new Solomon, a king chosen by heaven to establish God's dwelling place on earth. Just as Solomon had built the first temple in Jerusalem, Constantine would build monumental churches in Rome. The parallel was deliberate, a message carved into architecture. Descriptions of these early basilicas show details that hint at Solomonic ideals. Wide central aisles, leading to a sacred altar, mirrored the long halls leading into the Holy of Holies. Rows of columns were not only structural but symbolic, recalling the pillars of Boaz and Jachin that once flanked the temple entrance. The use of gold and precious stones within these sanctuaries echoed the biblical accounts of Solomon overlaying the temple walls with shimmering splendor. To stand inside one of Constantine's churches was to feel not only the triumph of Christianity, but the revival of a forgotten vision of divine architecture. Constantine's role was more than that of a patron. He cast himself as a sacred ruler, chosen to unite heaven and earth through his reign. Coins and inscriptions from his time often portray him bathed in light, crowned not just by empire, but by divine favor. In this sense, his churches were as much political monuments as spiritual ones. They declared that Constantine's authority, like Solomon's, was rooted in the will of God. To challenge the emperor was to challenge the order of heaven itself. The influence of this vision extended beyond Rome. In Jerusalem, Constantine ordered the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a project that linked Christian worship directly to the city of David and Solomon. By reclaiming Jerusalem with monumental Christian architecture, he further tied his reign to the legacy of Israel's greatest king. The statement was clear: the divine temple had not vanished. It had returned, now rebuilt, in the form of churches dedicated to Christ. Looking back, Constantine's architectural program was not random. It was a deliberate attempt to inherit the mantle of Solomon, to shape the church as the new temple, and himself as the chosen king who made it possible. The echoes of this vision would ripple for centuries, influencing how the Vatican and its successors saw themselves. Through Constantine, the blueprint of Solomon's temple was not only remembered, it was reborn, reshaped in stone to establish the throne of faith that still towers over the world today. In the days of Solomon's temple, the heartbeat of worship was not the stone itself, but the men who served within it. The Levitical priesthood, descended from the tribe of Levi, carried the sacred duty of offering sacrifices, burning incense, and guarding the mysteries of the Holy of Holies. Their garments were adorned with symbols of heaven, their rituals carefully measured by divine law. They stood as mediators between the people and God. Without them, the temple would have been just another building. With them, it became the center of the spiritual world. Centuries later, as Christianity rose, and the Vatican began to claim its place as the new Jerusalem, a new priesthood emerged. But when you study its structure, something uncanny appears. The hierarchy of popes, cardinals, bishops, and priests mirrors in many ways the order of the Levites. At the very top, the high priest once entered the Holy of Holies to stand before the Ark of the Covenant. In Rome, the Pope, called the Vicar of Christ, occupies the highest seat of authority, the one who speaks as the ultimate mediator. The parallel is hard to ignore. The vestments tell their own story. In the temple, the high priest wore a breastplate embedded with 12 stones, each representing the tribes of Israel. In the Vatican, the Pope and cardinals wear robes of rich colours, embroidered with crosses and symbols meant to convey spiritual authority. Both traditions treat clothing not as fabric, but as sacred armour, a visual signal of divine power. Even the use of incense, first rising in the temple as a symbol of prayers reaching heaven, continues in Catholic liturgy as clouds of smoke drift through cathedrals during Mass. Rituals too connect these two worlds. The Levites were required to perform sacrifices at set times, ensuring that Israel remained in covenant with God. The Catholic priest offers the Eucharist, the sacrifice of the Mass, believed to be a continuation of the covenant in a new form. Both acts reinforce the idea that without priestly mediation, ordinary believers cannot stand directly before the divine. Access is filtered, guarded, controlled. The hierarchy of the Vatican also reflects the layered access of the temple. Ordinary worshippers gathered in the outer courts. Priests moved within the holy place. Only the high priest stepped into the inner chamber. In Rome, pilgrims fill St. Peter's Square and churches across the world. Priests lead them in worship, but only the Pope presides as the ultimate spiritual authority. The pattern remains, though the names have changed. Was this deliberate design or natural evolution? If the Vatican sought to position itself as the successor to Jerusalem's temple, then echoing its priesthood was a powerful way to do so. By creating a structure that mirrored the Levites, Rome claimed continuity with the covenant of old while presenting itself as the sole guardian of the new. The Levitical line may have ended when the temple was destroyed, but in a sense it was reborn in the papal throne. And if that is true, then every mass, every vestment, every ritual is not only Christian tradition, it is the shadow of Solomon's priesthood still alive in the heart of Rome. When the Crusaders marched into Jerusalem in the year 1099, they claimed their mission was holy. They fought to reclaim the city for Christendom, to free pilgrims from danger, and to plant the banner of the cross where the temple once stood. Yet beneath the cries of battle and the prayers of victory, another quest stirred. Many of the knights who reached Jerusalem were not satisfied with stones and streets. They hungered for what lay hidden below, the remnants of the Temple of Solomon. Legends grew quickly around their presence. The knights did not merely guard the city, they began to dig. Beneath the platform where the temple had once risen, now crowned by the dome of the rock, tunnels and passages were explored in secret. What were they searching for? Chronicles from that time speak vaguely of treasures, relics, and scrolls. Some whispered of golden vessels carried from Babylon and Rome. Others believed the Ark of the Covenant itself might still be buried there, sealed away by priests during the fall. The Crusaders were warriors, but they were also seekers of knowledge that had been forbidden for centuries. It was during this period that the Order of the Knights Templar was born. Officially, their duty was to protect pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem. Unofficially, stories claim they discovered something extraordinary beneath the ruins. Some said ancient texts containing Solomonic wisdom. Others believed they uncovered artifacts that proved the connection between the temple and the new Church of Rome. Whatever it was, the Templars rose from obscurity to become one of the most powerful and wealthy orders in Europe. Their sudden rise makes sense only if they had gained something more than swords and shields. The Vatican took careful notice. The Templars pledged loyalty to the Pope, not to kings, and their authority spread quickly. Their wealth was unmatched, their secrecy legendary. Across Europe, whispers began that the Templars had carried hidden knowledge out of Jerusalem, knowledge that gave them power in both finance and faith. What kind of knowledge could lift a band of knights into such influence? Only something tied to the Temple of Solomon, the very heart of biblical history. For years, the Crusaders held Jerusalem, and during that time they continued to guard the Temple Mount with unusual devotion. It was as if they believed their true prize was not the city itself, but the secrets buried beneath it. When Jerusalem eventually fell again, the Templars carried their mystery back west, to castles, cathedrals, and perhaps into the very vaults of the Vatican. The Crusaders' quest was never just about land. It was about unlocking what had been sealed for over 1,000 years. They came with swords but left with something far more dangerous, fragments of wisdom and relics that could shift the balance of power in Christendom. And if those discoveries were delivered into the hands of the Vatican, then the echoes of Solomon's temple were no longer buried under Jerusalem's stones. They were carried into Rome, where they would be guarded in silence and hidden from the world. In the early 12th century, less than 20 years after the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, a small group of knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. At first, their mission seemed humble, to protect pilgrims travelling the dangerous roads to the Holy Land. But what gave them their name was far more revealing. They were housed on the Temple Mount itself, the very ground where Solomon's temple once stood. Out of all the places in Jerusalem, why there? Almost immediately, rumours began to swirl. The Knights, later known as the Templars, were not simply guarding the ruins. They were digging, For 9 years, very little was recorded of their activity, a silence in history that raised suspicion. Pilgrims saw earthworks and strange movements near the old foundations. Some claimed the knights had discovered sealed passages under the mount, tunnels leading into chambers untouched since the destruction of the temple nearly 1,000 years earlier. What could they have found? The stories vary, but they all point to treasures of more than gold. Some say they unearthed sacred relics, fragments of Solomon's temple vessels, or even pieces of the Ark of the Covenant. Others whisper of scrolls, ancient writings that contained forbidden knowledge, secrets of sacred geometry, astronomy, and rituals once guarded by Israel's priests. Knowledge that could change how the world understood faith and power. The rise of the Templars adds weight to these stories. In less than a generation, they transformed from a handful of knights into one of the wealthiest and most influential orders in Europe. Kings trusted them, nobles financed them, and the Pope granted them privileges no other group enjoyed. How did such power appear so quickly? Wealth alone cannot explain it. Influence of this scale suggests they held something priceless, something that gave them leverage over both crown and church. The connection to Solomon's temple remained central to their identity. Their official seal bore the image of the temple, and their very name carried it forward. They saw themselves not merely as warriors, but as guardians of a hidden legacy. Cathedrals financed by Templar wealth often carried unusual designs, with hints of sacred geometry said to mirror the lost proportions of the temple itself. Symbols carved into their chapels suggested they preserved knowledge from Jerusalem in coded form. The Vatican tolerated their growing power for a time, perhaps even benefited from what they uncovered. But the secrecy of the Templars made rulers uneasy. Were they merely soldiers of Christ, or had they become keepers of something too dangerous to reveal? Their fate, in later centuries, would prove how threatening hidden knowledge could be. The birth of the Templars was no ordinary military order. It was the rebirth of a mystery tied to the Temple of Solomon. Whether relics, scrolls, or treasures, what they found beneath Jerusalem changed history. And though the ruins of the temple remain silent, the sudden rise of the Templars suggests that its secrets did not vanish. They were simply carried into the shadows, guarded by knights who wore the cross but followed whispers far older than Christianity itself. When the Knights Templar dug beneath the Temple Mount and emerged with power that seemed to appear from nowhere, the world wondered what they had discovered. Their rise was too sudden, their influence too vast, to be explained by swords and devotion alone. If they truly uncovered relics or scrolls from Solomon's temple, then the question becomes, what happened to those treasures once the Templars grew too powerful for kings and popes to tolerate? History tells us the order was destroyed in the early 14th century. Its members arrested, tortured, and burned. Yet what vanished along with them was far more than their gold. It may have been knowledge, documents, and relics quietly transferred into the hands of the Vatican. Consider the silence that followed the fall of the Templars. For nearly 2 centuries they had been one of the most powerful organizations in Europe, only to be crushed in a wave of accusations. Their supposed confessions of heresy read more like fabrications than truth, but the swiftness with which their assets were seized points to something deeper. Kings absorbed their lands, the church absorbed their authority, but what about the objects and manuscripts they had carried from Jerusalem? Those were too valuable to scatter. They were too dangerous to leave in the open. The Vatican is the most likely destination. For centuries, it had been collecting manuscripts, artifacts, and relics, building what would become one of the largest hidden archives on Earth. If the Templars had uncovered temple treasures, the Church would have ensured their transfer to Rome under the guise of preserving faith. Yet preservation can also mean concealment. Imagine scrolls describing Solomonic rituals, architectural blueprints, or even fragments of the Ark of the Covenant locked away in Vatican vaults. Such items would not only prove a direct line from the temple to the church, but also give the Vatican unrivaled spiritual authority. The secrecy of the Vatican archive adds fuel to this speculation. Its miles of shelves, its restricted access, its refusal to release certain manuscripts, all suggest it holds far more than theology. What if somewhere within its stone chambers are the very scrolls the Templars found? What if relics once thought lost forever rest in boxes labelled only with vague titles? For the Vatican, to possess the legacy of Solomon's Temple would be to claim the inheritance of God's dwelling place. It would make Rome not only the new Jerusalem in spirit, but also in possession of its most sacred objects. The transfer may never be proven, but the pattern of history points to it. When powerful knowledge threatens to destabilize the world, it does not vanish, it is hidden, and no institution has hidden more effectively than the Vatican. The story of the Templars ends in fire, but the story of what they found may continue in silence. If their treasures truly reached Rome, then the echoes of Solomon's Temple are not gone. They lie beneath Vatican walls, guarded as fiercely as they were once guarded in Jerusalem, a secret that still shapes the course of history. The Knights Templar began as humble warriors sworn to protect pilgrims, yet within a century they had become one of the most powerful organizations in Europe. Their sudden wealth and influence were no accident. They owed their rise to an unusual relationship with the Vatican. Unlike other orders tied to kings or nobles, the Templars swore direct allegiance to the Pope. This pact gave them freedom from taxes, independence from local rulers, and the ability to operate across borders. They were answerable only to Rome, a privilege that made them untouchable in the eyes of kings. But the very protection that secured their rise may have sealed their downfall. The Vatican benefited from the Templars' success. The Knights were fierce soldiers, disciplined bankers, and reliable allies in the Crusades. They guarded treasures, financed monarchs, and managed vast estates. In return, the Church offered its blessing and shielded them from interference. Yet beneath this partnership lurked an open question. What had the Templars uncovered in Jerusalem, and how much of that knowledge was shared with Rome? If they truly found relics or documents tied to Solomon's Temple, the Vatican would have seen their value. But the more power the Templars gained, the greater the danger that such secrets might slip beyond papal control. By the early 14th century, the Templars had grown too rich and too independent. Kings envied their wealth, and rumours of strange rituals made them a target. In the year 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Templars. Under torture, confessions of heresy spilled out, though most were forced and unreliable. Still, the damage was done. The Vatican, pressured by Philip, turned against the very order it once protected. Pope Clement V dissolved the Templars, their leaders were executed, and their legacy was buried beneath shame. But was the betrayal simply political, or was it something more? Some historians suggest the Vatican feared what the Templars carried from Jerusalem. If the order had uncovered documents that challenged the Church's narrative, or relics that could prove a rival claim to spiritual authority, silencing them was the only option. Destroying the order removed the threat, while anything of value could be absorbed into Vatican secrecy. It was not only a betrayal, it was an act of control. The irony is hard to miss. The Templars once thrived under papal protection, believing their loyalty made them untouchable. Yet when the time came, the Vatican did not shield them. It sacrificed them. Their downfall erased questions about what they had discovered, leaving the Church as the sole custodian of whatever truths remained. The pact between the Templars and the Vatican ended not in triumph, but in betrayal, a reminder that alliances built on secrets cannot last. Perhaps the real question is not whether the Templars were guilty of heresy, but whether their greatest crime was knowing too much. If they had uncovered the hidden legacy of Solomon's Temple, then their destruction was less about sin and more about silence. And in that silence, the Vatican ensured that the deepest mysteries of the Temple would remain locked away guarded not by knights in armour, but by walls of stone and centuries of secrecy. In the biblical account of Solomon's temple, 2 great pillars stood at the entrance. They were not part of the walls, nor did they hold up the roof. Their purpose was symbolic. One was called Boaz, the other Jachin, names that carried meanings of strength and stability. They marked the threshold between the ordinary world and the sacred presence of God. For centuries their memory has lingered, and though the temple itself was destroyed, the image of those twin pillars never disappeared. Instead, it resurfaced in some of the most unexpected places, including the heart of the Vatican. Walk into St. Peter's Basilica, and you will notice towering spiral columns rising around the papal altar. They are said to echo the lost columns of Solomon's temple. Renaissance artists, inspired by ancient descriptions, wove these images into their work as a way of connecting Rome's authority with Jerusalem's sacred past. In paintings and frescoes commissioned by popes, the motif of paired pillars appears again and again, often flanking thrones or altars, symbols of divine approval and unshakable order. Even papal insignia have carried this theme. Certain coats of arms and emblems used by church leaders feature twin structures framing a central symbol, a subtle nod to the balance of Boaz and Jachin. Whether the church acknowledged it openly or not, these designs tied the Vatican visually to Solomon's temple, reinforcing the claim that Rome had inherited its sacred mantle. To step into the grand basilicas of Europe was to walk through spaces designed to whisper of a forgotten past, a past where 2 pillars once stood at the gateway to God. The twin pillars also found their way into Masonic symbolism, which itself has long been linked to both Solomon's temple and accusations of hidden ties to the Vatican. Freemasons use Boaz and Jachin as central images in their lodges, teaching that they represent wisdom and strength, the balance of opposing forces that open the way to knowledge. Some argue that this is no coincidence, that the survival of the pillars' symbolism from the Bible to the Vatican to secret societies shows a chain of guardianship over ancient truths. The pillars become more than architectural memory. They become keys, markers of a path through history that only the initiated can read. Why did this image survive when so much else about the temple was forgotten? Perhaps because symbols are harder to erase than objects. A relic can be hidden in a vault, but an idea carved in stone or painted on canvas can endure. By embedding the twin pillars into its art and architecture, the Vatican ensured that a piece of Solomon's temple lived on in the Christian world. Whether as conscious inheritance or quiet borrowing, the result is the same. The threshold of Boaz and Jachin still stands, not in Jerusalem, but in Rome, woven into a legacy that stretches from the ancient temple to the very heart of the Church's authority. At the heart of Solomon's temple stood the Holy of Holies, a chamber so sacred that only the high priest could enter, and only once each year on the Day of Atonement. It was a hidden place, shrouded by veils, filled with mystery, and believed to house the very presence of God. This inner sanctum was not vast in size, but it was immense in meaning. It represented the spiritual center of the world, the point where heaven touched earth. Centuries later, when St. Peter's Basilica was raised in Rome, its design carried an echo of that ancient sanctum, not in a hidden chamber, but in a soaring dome that towers above the city. The dome of St. Peter's, designed by Michelangelo in the 16th century, dominates the skyline of Rome. To stand beneath it is to feel dwarfed by its immensity, its circular form rising toward the heavens. Yet its placement directly above the papal altar is what makes it significant. Just as the Holy of Holies stood at the innermost heart of the temple, the dome crowns the most sacred spot in the basilica. Beneath it lies not only the altar, but also the crypt said to hold the tomb of St. Peter himself. The layering of sacred space, from the grave to the altar to the dome, mirrors the concentric sanctity of the ancient temple, where the outer courts led to the holy place, and finally to the innermost chamber. The dome functions as a visual veil, a symbol of heaven enclosing the holy. In ancient times, the veil of the temple separated ordinary men from the presence of God. In Rome, the dome becomes the veil turned outward, not concealing but displaying divine majesty to all who enter. It is a shift in form, but not in meaning. Both structures declare that within these walls lies the ultimate meeting point between human and divine. Even the proportions carry hidden messages. The measurements of Solomon's sanctum were precise, laid out in cubits with deliberate symmetry. Michelangelo, steeped in Renaissance fascination with sacred geometry, designed the dome with mathematical precision, ensuring it represented not only beauty, but cosmic harmony. To those who study architecture, the dome is more than engineering. It is a continuation of a tradition that began in Jerusalem, an attempt to build heaven on earth using stone, proportion, and light. The experience of entering either space is strikingly similar. Ancient worshippers approached the temple with awe, aware that beyond its veils rested mystery. Visitors to street. Peter's gaze upward, their eyes drawn to the vast canopy of the dome, feeling the weight of eternity pressing down. Both spaces leave the believer humbled, small before the enormity of divine presence. The Holy of Holies is gone, its stones lost to time. Yet its idea survives in the dome of St. Peter's, reshaped for a new age but carrying the same message. Rome inherited the architectural soul of Jerusalem. The sanctum became a dome, the veil became the sky, and the Vatican placed itself firmly as the keeper of the place where heaven and earth still meet. In the middle of St. Peter's Square rises a monument that at first seems out of place. It is not a cross, not a statue of a saint, but a tall red granite obelisk carried from ancient Egypt. It once stood in Heliopolis, city of the sun, before being moved to Rome by an emperor. For centuries, it stood in the Circus of Nero, where early Christians were executed, including, tradition says, St. Peter himself. In the year 1586, Pope Sixtus V ordered it to be moved to the centre of the newly designed square in front of St. Peter's Basilica. Since then, millions of pilgrims have walked past it, often without asking why a pagan monument occupies the most sacred plaza of the Vatican. The official explanation is that the obelisk was reconsecrated, its pagan associations stripped away and replaced by a bronze cross placed at its summit. It was meant to declare the triumph of Christianity over ancient religions. Yet, when you look deeper, the story becomes more complicated. The obelisk was not merely a trophy. It was placed with deliberate precision, aligned with the geometry of the square and the axis of the basilica. The choice to position it at the centre was no accident. It transformed the pagan monument into the focal point of one of the most symbolic Christian spaces on earth. The obelisk carries echoes of something older still. In biblical descriptions, Solomon's temple was built with sacred geometry in mind, its proportions designed to mirror cosmic order. The obelisk, a symbol of the sun's eternal power, was also a geometric marker, its shadow tracking the movements of time. To set it in the heart of St. Peter's Square was to revive a tradition of blending astronomy, geometry, and sacred space. The Vatican may have declared it Christian, but its placement suggests continuity with a far older stream of knowledge. Even more intriguing is how the obelisk functions within the square. Each year, at specific times, the shadow of the obelisk aligns perfectly with markings on the pavement, turning the square into a vast sundial. Pilgrims may not notice, but the design ties the monument to the heavens. It is not just decoration. It is a cosmic instrument, echoing the role of ancient temples as maps of the universe. In this way, the Vatican Square mirrors Jerusalem, where the temple once stood as a symbol of the cosmos, a link between heaven and earth. Was this deliberate memory of Solomon's temple, or was it a silent inheritance, passed through centuries of architecture and ritual? The Vatican never explains why the obelisk was preserved when so many other pagan structures were destroyed. Perhaps they understood that symbols have power, and that to erase them is to lose part of the sacred blueprint. By placing the obelisk at the centre, They claimed dominion not by destroying the past, but by absorbing it. The Vatican obelisk stands today as a paradox, a pagan relic crowned with a Christian cross, a foreign monument turned into the axis of the Church's heart. It is both out of place and perfectly placed, a reminder that the memory of Solomon's temple may not be preserved only in texts, but in stone, geometry, and symbols standing silently at the very centre of Rome. When visitors step into the Vatican museums or the Sistine Chapel, they see beauty that overwhelms the senses. The frescoes of Raphael, the ceiling painted by Michelangelo, the endless galleries filled with colour and form all seem to celebrate Christian triumph. Yet hidden beneath the brushstrokes lies a language few are taught to read. Renaissance artists were masters not only of paint, but of symbolism, and within their art, they embedded echoes of Solomon's temple. The Vatican may appear as the centre of Christian faith, but its walls are decorated with reminders of a much older sacred tradition. Raphael's frescoes in the papal apartments, known as the Raphael rooms, contain striking examples. In the school of Athens, while philosophers like Plato and Aristotle take centre stage, architectural details frame them with arches and pillars that mirror descriptions of the temple. Even in a painting dedicated to philosophy, the geometry of the background whispers of sacred design. In another fresco, the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, the altar is framed by structures that suggest the Holy of Holies, a place where heaven and earth converge. Raphael painted theology, but he also painted architecture, and his choice of forms suggests deliberate memory of Solomon's proportions. Michelangelo was even bolder. On the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the central panels depict the creation of the world and the story of humanity, but the structure of the ceiling itself recalls the divisions of sacred space. Painted columns divide the panels, echoing Boaz and Jachin, the twin pillars of the temple. The design creates a rhythm that guides the eye, reminding viewers that they are not just looking at stories, but at a cosmic order shaped by ancient patterns. Even the proportions of the chapel itself, long noted by scholars, are remarkably similar to the biblical measurements of Solomon's temple. Whether by coincidence or intent, Michelangelo's masterpiece functions as more than art. It becomes a coded temple in paint and stone. Artists of the Renaissance lived in an age of rediscovery, when forgotten manuscripts and ancient philosophies resurfaced. The Vatican was the keeper of many of these texts, and it is no stretch to imagine that Raphael and Michelangelo were guided, subtly or directly, to weave fragments of Solomonic imagery into their work. To the ordinary eye, the frescoes are simply magnificent. To the initiated, they may reveal a continuity of sacred knowledge preserved in brushstrokes and geometry. Why hide such codes in art? Perhaps because symbols survive where words can be silenced. A manuscript can be locked in the Vatican archive, but a fresco painted on the Pope's wall remains in plain sight, protected by its beauty. To embed Solomonic imagery in art was to ensure that memory of the temple lived on, even if most would never recognize it. The Vatican became not only the guardian of relics, but also the curator of images that tied its power to Jerusalem's lost sanctuary. To this day, millions of visitors gaze at Raphael's rooms and Michelangelo's ceiling without realizing that beneath the color lies a code that links Rome to Solomon's temple, painted in symbols that endure across centuries, whispering to those who know how to see. Beneath the bustling streets of Vatican City lies a place few have ever seen, a labyrinth of stone corridors and locked chambers stretching for miles. This is the Vatican's secret archive, a name that has long stirred curiosity and suspicion. Though officials claim the word secretum only means private, the reality is more haunting. Access is tightly controlled. Only a handful of scholars are permitted to study small fragments, and even they are bound by restrictions. What lies sealed away on the shelves has never been fully revealed. Some whisper that among the papal decrees and letters of kings rests something far older, documents that trace their origins back not to Rome, but to Jerusalem, to the Temple of Solomon itself. Imagine manuscripts carried across centuries, describing in detail the rituals once performed by the Levites, the measurements of the courts and chambers, and the precise cosmic alignments that gave the temple its place in the universe. These texts, if they exist, would be unlike anything else in the archive. They would not be Christian in origin, but Jewish, rescued or perhaps taken from hidden places during the Crusades or earlier. The Templars, who dug beneath the Temple Mount in the 12th century, were rumoured to have found such writings. If they did, their eventual disappearance at the hands of the Church suggests those manuscripts may have ended up in the Vatican vaults. The very idea is staggering. If scrolls of the temple survived, they would shed light on secrets long debated. How were sacrifices performed? What role did music, incense, and sacred geometry play? Did the priests track the stars to mark holy days, aligning their rituals with the heavens? Such knowledge would reveal that the temple was not only a building, but a cosmic machine designed to harmonize earth with sky. For the Vatican to possess such documents would give it a direct line to the oldest sacred tradition of the West. Whispers from the few who have studied fragments in the archive add fuel to this speculation. Scholars have spoken of strange diagrams, notes in ancient Greek and Latin that seem to reference the temple. Others suggest manuscripts exist in languages not yet fully deciphered, perhaps Proto-Hebrew or early Coptic, describing ceremonies that never made it into the Bible. If true, these documents would not only confirm the depth of Solomonic wisdom, but also explain why the Vatican guards them so fiercely. Knowledge that powerful could reshape how we see history, religion, and the very purpose of sacred architecture. The Vatican remains silent, offering no confirmation, only denial cloaked in formality, yet silence often hides more than it reveals. If the secret archive truly contains temple files, then within those stone walls lies the lost memory of Jerusalem's greatest sanctuary. A memory that, if released, could unravel the neat divide between Judaism and Christianity, between the temple and the church. And so the doors remain closed, the shelves unseen, leaving us to wonder if the blueprints of Solomon's temple still exist, not in Jerusalem, but in Rome, buried in shadows. From the beginning, sacred buildings were never just places of prayer. They were instruments of time, carefully aligned with the heavens to mark the rhythms of the universe. Solomon's temple, described in scripture with exact measurements, is believed by many scholars to have been more than a house of worship. Its orientation, its windows, and its courts appear to align with the rising and setting of the sun on key days of the year. Some traditions claim the temple acted as a kind of calendar, a place where priests could read the sky and declare the sacred festivals. The placement of its inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, may have mirrored not only divine presence, but also cosmic order. To stand within it was to stand at the very center of time. Centuries later, when the Vatican rose to power, a similar pattern emerged. Rome built observatories, not merely to satisfy curiosity about the stars, but to control the calendar itself. The Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical institutions in the world, was established in the 16th century. Its purpose was not hidden. By tracking the heavens, the Church could decide when Easter should fall, when fasts should begin, and when feasts should be celebrated. In effect, by observing the stars, the Vatican held authority over the flow of human time. The Church became not only the guardian of faith, but also the keeper of the clock. The parallels between the Temple and the Vatican are striking. In both, priests served as astronomers, interpreting the heavens for the people. In Jerusalem, Levites may have watched the skies to declare new moons and holy days. In Rome, Jesuit scholars recorded eclipses, comets, and planetary movements, ensuring that the liturgical year followed patterns deemed divinely ordained. Both systems presented the same message. Truth comes not from ordinary men watching the stars, but from the chosen few who hold the keys to interpretation. Even architecture reflects this link. The obelisk in St. Peter's Square functions as a sundial, marking the passing hours with mathematical precision. Pilgrims may walk across its shadow without realizing they are stepping on a vast instrument of time, one that ties the Vatican's authority to the movement of the Sunday. In the same way, Solomon's temple may have functioned as a living calendar, with light pouring through its doors in alignment with seasonal transitions. Stone and shadow worked together to remind worshippers that divine power ruled not only the earth but the heavens. Astrology, too, played its quiet role. Though condemned publicly, hints of its use appear in both traditions. Some rabbis believed the temple's design reflected the constellations. In the Renaissance, Vatican art filled ceilings and chapels with zodiac signs, disguised as decoration but carrying deeper meaning. The sky was not ignored, it was encoded, woven into sacred space. To control time is to control life itself. The Temple of Solomon and the Vatican both understood this truth. By aligning their structures to the heavens, they claimed not only to serve God, but to measure his universe. And in doing so, they placed themselves as the bridge between the stars above and the people below, guardians of faith and masters of time. When people think of Solomon, they think of wisdom. The Bible tells stories of a king who judged with fairness, who built a magnificent temple, and who spoke with an understanding that seemed beyond human reach. His reign became the standard of divine kingship, a vision of authority grounded not just in power but in knowledge. For centuries, rulers across the world tried to compare themselves to Solomon, but none more persistently than the popes of Rome. In their quest to present themselves as heirs of both spiritual and earthly authority, they borrowed the image of Solomon, using his name and legacy to shape papal identity. During the Middle Ages and Renaissance, popes commissioned art, architecture, and texts that placed them in direct succession to Solomon. Street. Peter's Basilica itself, rising like a new temple, was seen as Rome's answer to Jerusalem's lost sanctuary. By presenting the church as the true dwelling place of God, the Pope could claim the role of Solomon reborn, not as a king in armour, but as a priest-king clothed in sacred vestments. Just as Solomon was called chosen by God to rule with wisdom, so too was the Pope called to rule with divine insight. This connection was not accidental. It was cultivated carefully to make papal authority appear unshakable. In official documents and sermons, popes were often described with Solomonic language. They were said to be the new fountain of wisdom, the voice of God's judgment on earth, the guardians of sacred tradition. Some even commissioned coronation rituals that echoed biblical descriptions of Solomon's anointing. To place oil on the head of a pope was not only a blessing, it was a symbolic act that tied him to the greatest king Israel had ever known. In that moment, the message was clear. The line of Solomon did not end in Jerusalem, it continued in Rome. Art reinforced this image. In the frescoes of the Vatican, Solomon often appears in the background of papal portraits, a subtle reminder of the link. In Raphael's works, for example, scenes of judgment and temple imagery appear beside images of popes, merging their authority with the memory of the ancient king. This visual language taught pilgrims and rulers alike that to resist the pope was to resist the wisdom of Solomon himself. The connection was not only spiritual, it was political. The irony is that Solomon's wisdom was often described as a gift that came directly from God, not from institutions. Yet the Vatican used his image to strengthen its own hierarchy, turning a personal gift of insight into a symbol of institutional power. By styling themselves as heirs of Solomon, popes claimed not just divine blessing but divine legitimacy. Their authority was not simply inherited from Peter or Christ, but from the wisest ruler of Israel. In the end, the figure of Solomon became a tool, a mirror in which popes could see themselves as both kings and priests. Whether or not the wisdom matched the claim, the image endured. And through it, papal authority gained a foundation that reached back not just centuries, but all the way to the golden throne of Israel's most legendary king. In the days of Solomon's temple, worship was not casual. It followed a strict rhythm of rites, garments, and offerings that marked every moment as sacred. Incense was burned until smoke filled the sanctuary, symbolizing prayers rising to heaven. Sacrifices were laid on the altar, representing covenant and atonement. Priests wore garments embroidered with symbols of divine order, their robes setting them apart from ordinary men. The temple was a theatre of sacred continuity, a place where each act reinforced the bond between God and his people. Though the temple itself was destroyed long ago, echoes of its rituals continue to this very day, carried forward in the Catholic liturgy of the Vatican and beyond. Step inside a Catholic cathedral, and the atmosphere feels strangely familiar to descriptions of the temple. Incense still drifts through the air during Mass, released from swinging censers in the hands of priests. The rising smoke is explained as a symbol of prayer, the same explanation given by ancient Levites when they filled the temple courts with its fragrance. The continuity is undeniable. What began in Jerusalem continues in Rome, repackaged but not erased. The Eucharist, the central act of Catholic worship, also recalls temple practice. Instead of animal sacrifice, bread and wine are offered on the altar. Catholics believe this act represents the sacrifice of Christ, but its form mirrors the daily offerings once performed in the temple. A holy meal, a sacred altar, a priest standing as mediator, all of it echoes rituals from long before Christianity was born. The gestures may have changed, but the pattern remains the same. Priestly garments too tell the story. In the temple, priests wore robes of fine linen, belts of blue and gold, and a breastplate set with 12 stones representing Israel's tribes. In the Vatican, priests and bishops wear robes of white, scarlet, and gold, often embroidered with symbols of divine authority. The Pope himself wears a mitre, a headpiece that resembles ancient crowns of high priests. Clothing in both traditions is not simply decoration, but a declaration of sacred identity. To wear the garment is to step into a role that separates one from the ordinary world, signaling a direct link to the holy. Even the structure of worship reflects continuity. In the temple, only priests could enter the inner sanctuary. In Catholic liturgy, the altar is approached only by the ordained, while the congregation remains outside the sanctuary space. Music, chants, and sacred readings fill the service, just as psalms and trumpets once echoed through Jerusalem's courts. Every detail is designed to maintain continuity, to preserve a sense of timeless order. Perhaps this is why Catholic ritual feels ancient, even to those who do not believe. It carries the weight of centuries, layered upon centuries, until the line between old and new disappears. The Vatican has long presented itself as the inheritor of Solomon's legacy, not only in stone, but in practice. When incense rises, when garments shimmer, when bread and wine are lifted on high, the shadow of the temple returns. The rituals of continuity make sure that even though Solomon's sanctuary lies in ruins, its spirit still lives, carried on in every mass across the world. Freemasonry is one of the most mysterious brotherhoods in history, and at the heart of its teachings lies a single story: the building of Solomon's temple. Masonic rituals, symbols, and legends all trace back to the Temple Mount, where they claim their order began with the builders who raised the house of God. For centuries, initiates have been taught that they are heirs to the wisdom of the master architect, inheritors of secrets hidden in stone. Yet when you compare Masonic symbols with Vatican imagery, the parallels are unsettling. Two institutions that appear opposed on the surface may in fact share a common legacy, one rooted in the Solomonic tradition. In Masonic lodges across the world, the twin pillars Boaz and Jachin stand as central emblems. They are placed at the entrance of the lodge, marking the passage into sacred space, just as they once marked the threshold of the temple. Inside, compasses, squares, and the letter G symbolize divine geometry, the belief that the universe itself is structured with mathematical precision. Freemasons claim these tools were once held by the builders of Solomon's sanctuary, passed down through generations of secret guardianship. To become a Mason is to symbolically enter the temple and to learn its hidden language. But step into the Vatican and echoes of the same imagery appear. Spiral columns around the papal altar, frescoes filled with temple geometry, and coats of arms marked by twin structures mirror what Masons celebrate in their lodges. Even the idea of sacred architecture as a reflection of cosmic order is shared by both. Renaissance artists commissioned by popes filled chapels with Solomonic imagery, embedding the same codes Masons later claimed as their inheritance. This raises a haunting question. Did both institutions draw from the same well of hidden tradition? The rivalry between the Vatican and Freemasonry is well documented. For centuries, the Church condemned Masons, branding them as heretics and secret enemies. Yet the symbols suggest a deeper irony. The very imagery that Masons guard as their sacred origin is also preserved within the walls of Rome. The pillars, the compass of divine order, the vision of the temple as a universal blueprint, all appear in both worlds. Perhaps the conflict was not over differences, but over ownership of the same legacy. Some scholars suggest the Masons inherited fragments of Templar tradition, which itself was tied to discoveries made beneath the Temple Mount. If those fragments resembled what the Vatican already guarded, it would explain why both groups echo the same symbols. The Masons chose to keep them in open ritual, while the Vatican cloaked them in liturgy and art. Different expressions, but the same root. In the end, the Temple of Solomon remains the common ancestor. Freemasons claim it as their birthplace. The Vatican presents itself as its spiritual heir. Both speak its language of pillars, geometry, and wisdom. To the outside world, they appear as adversaries, yet beneath the rivalry may lie a hidden truth. That both the Masons and the popes are keepers of a Solomonic legacy that refuses to die, echoing across time in stone, ritual, and symbol. Beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica lies a world that few have seen. Pilgrims look upward at Michelangelo's dome, but deep under the marble floors are tunnels, crypts, and chambers that stretch into darkness. Officially, these areas are called the Vatican Grottos and Necropolis, burial places of early popes and Roman citizens. But rumours persist that the network extends much further than admitted, into secret passages and sealed vaults that may guard relics or symbols linked not only to Christianity, but to Solomon's temple itself. Excavations beneath the basilica began in earnest during the 20th century, when Pope Pius XII ordered work to confirm the presence of St. Peter's tomb. What the workers found was astonishing. Layers of Roman mausoleums, walls painted with strange symbols, and corridors that seemed older than the basilica itself. Some of these areas have been opened to select visitors, but many remain closed, locked away under Vatican control. Were Solomonic relics hidden here after the fall of Jerusalem? Did the Templars, or their successors, deposit treasures in Rome's foundations where they could never be touched? Whispers tell of chambers aligned with sacred geometry, echoing the layout of the temple in Jerusalem. The very foundation of the basilica may have been designed not only to honour Peter, but to mirror the Holy of Holies. In this theory, the high altar above and the tunnels below form a symbolic union, connecting Rome to the Temple Mount across both space and time. If relics of the temple were ever brought to the Vatican, the underground vaults would be the perfect place to hide them, beyond the eyes of kings and pilgrims. There are also tales of tunnels that link the Vatican to other key sites in Rome. Some claim they stretch as far as Castel Sant'Angelo, others that they lead into older catacombs where Christian and pre-Christian symbols blend. Could some of these routes have been adapted to house relics carried from the East? If scrolls, vessels, or even fragments of the Ark of the Covenant ever reached Rome, the vaults beneath the basilica would be the safest sanctuary, guarded by secrecy and layers of stone. The Vatican denies such claims, insisting that its excavations are purely archaeological, yet secrecy itself fuels the fire. When access is restricted, imagination fills the gaps. Pilgrims who glimpse locked doors and unlit passages wonder what lies beyond. Scholars who are refused entry speculate about hidden chambers that may never be shown to the public. If the Vatican truly guards Solomonic relics beneath its foundations, then St. Peter's Basilica is more than a church. It is a temple layered on top of a temple, a place where Jerusalem's lost sanctuary is reborn in Rome's soil. The tunnels and chambers would then serve as a hidden bridge between the two most sacred sites in history. Whether relics rest there or only symbols carved into forgotten walls, the idea remains the same. Beneath the Vatican may lie the last physical memory of Solomon's temple, hidden in silence, while the world above prays in ignorance. If the Vatican truly carries the legacy of Solomon's temple, one question looms above all others. Why hide it? Why not proclaim that the most sacred traditions of the ancient world have been preserved in Rome? The answer may be less about history and more about power. To reveal such a connection would open doors that the Church has spent centuries keeping locked. The temple was not only a holy building, but a prophetic symbol. Whoever controls its memory controls how people understand the promises of God, the flow of prophecy, and even the destiny of nations. By hiding the link, the Vatican keeps itself in control of that narrative. Prophecy plays a central role in this secrecy. The Bible speaks of a future temple, a dwelling place of God that will rise again. If people believed that fragments of the original design, or even relics of Solomon's temple, were hidden in Rome, questions would arise about whether the Vatican has already positioned itself as the fulfillment of that prophecy. By keeping the connection hidden, the Church avoids debate while quietly holding the claim to being God's chosen center on earth. Revelation belongs not to the world, but to those who guard the keys. Another motive lies in legitimacy. For centuries, the Church has presented itself as the New Jerusalem, the inheritor of God's covenant. To admit openly that its power rests on relics and rituals borrowed from Solomon's temple would weaken the illusion of originality. It would suggest that the Vatican's authority is not entirely its own but dependent on a legacy it inherited from the Jews. For an institution built on claims of divine independence, this would be an inconvenient truth, one better kept hidden beneath layers of ritual, art, and silence. There is also the danger of discovery. If the world knew that relics or manuscripts from the temple existed in the Vatican vaults, the pressure to release them would be overwhelming. Scholars, governments, and religious groups would demand access. Rival claims to spiritual authority would erupt. Control over the narrative of God's presence would no longer rest solely with Rome. By hiding the connection, the Vatican prevents chaos and keeps its power intact. Finally, secrecy protects mystery itself. Religion thrives not only on answers but on questions. The more hidden the truth, the greater the awe it inspires. By cloaking the link to Solomon's temple, the Vatican ensures that faith is not reduced to archaeology. Instead, it remains wrapped in wonder, controlled by those who claim to know but refuse to show. In the end, the motives for hiding the connection converge on one theme: control. Control of prophecy, control of legitimacy, control of inconvenient truths. Whether or not the Vatican truly possesses the relics or knowledge of the temple, it acts as if it does, guarding its silence as fiercely as it guards its treasures. And perhaps that silence is the greatest power of all, because it leaves the world asking questions, while the answers remain locked away in Rome. From the ruins of Jerusalem to the marble halls of Rome, one theme has endured across the centuries. The Temple of Solomon, the most mysterious and sacred structure of the ancient world, may not have been lost at all. Perhaps it was reborn, transformed, and reshaped into the very foundations of the Vatican. Stone by stone, symbol by symbol, ritual by ritual, the echoes of the temple seem to live on in street. Peter's Basilica, in the Vatican's art, in its archives, and even in the rituals still practiced today. If this is true, then history as we know it is not a story of destruction and replacement, but of transformation. The temple never ended, it simply changed form. Think about what this means. The pillars of Boaz and Jachin reappear in church architecture and papal symbols. The Holy of Holies is mirrored in the dome that crowns Rome. The obelisk in street, Peter's Square, recalls ancient sacred geometry. The priesthood of the Levites finds new life in the hierarchy of pope, cardinals, and bishops. Even the rituals of incense, sacrifice, and sacred garments survive in Catholic liturgy. These are not coincidences, they are continuities, threads tying the past to the present. The temple may have been torn down, but its blueprint still guides the most powerful religious institution on earth. For centuries, questions have been whispered. Did the Templars find relics or manuscripts beneath the ruins of the Temple Mount? Were these treasures secretly delivered to Rome? Does the Vatican guard scrolls that describe the lost rituals, dimensions, and cosmic alignments of Solomon's sanctuary? Officially, the Church remains silent, but the secrecy of the archives, the coded imagery in Renaissance art, and the uncanny parallels in architecture all suggest that the answer may be yes. If so, then the greatest treasure of all is not hidden gold or relics, but the knowledge that the temple never truly disappeared. This realization casts history in a new light. The Vatican's claim to be the New Jerusalem takes on deeper meaning if it carries within its walls the very legacy of the old. Prophecy itself could be shaped by such a truth. If the temple was never lost, only reborn in Rome, then the future of faith might depend not on a rebuilding in Jerusalem, but on what has already been preserved in the Vatican. The idea is unsettling, even haunting, because it means the line between past and present has been deliberately blurred. So, we end with a question that echoes through time. If the Vatican truly holds the legacy of Solomon's temple, what does that mean for history, for prophecy, and for our future? Is Rome the keeper of an eternal temple, hidden in plain sight? Or has the greatest secret of all been waiting beneath domes and altars for someone to uncover? The temple may not be gone. It may be standing still, disguised as something else, carrying its ancient power into an age that has forgotten where it began.